Be grateful for whatever your experience of this moment is, and if you cannot be grateful, at least allow it to be, because it already is. Now, if you did this little thing, allowing your experience of this moment to be the way it is, that would already remove a gigantic chunk of unhappiness in whatever form. Unhappiness is the most generic term one could use. The Buddha called it suffering. That obviously is one of the practices, not to internally resist your experience of this moment. Many times, possibly you'll forget that, and that's fine. The moment you realize that you forgot it, it's there again, and then you can accept your experience of this moment as the unhappiness that is arising in you because you forgot to accept your experience of this moment, and so you feel this unhappiness arising in you, and you say, where does that come from? Oh, I forgot to accept my experience of this moment. And then you accept the unhappiness. And the weird thing with unhappiness is, when you completely accept the unhappiness, it cannot survive very long. It cannot actually coexist with acceptance. So the weird thing then arises that you say something like, okay, I'm unhappy, it's okay, I don't mind being unhappy. And then the unhappiness goes, what's going on? That's not supposed to happen. The unhappiness cannot survive for very long with the acceptance, even the acceptance of unhappiness, not indulging in unhappiness, but the acceptance. Now, the acceptance of unhappiness, it presupposes that there's an awareness there that knows that you're unhappy. Now, that might sound like something very natural, but it isn't, because the most unhappy people, and there are still millions, and of course they have reasons for being unhappy, yes. And it's not necessarily the people who you'd think would have the most powerful reasons for being unhappy. It's often those who you would think, well, there are many millions who have it worse than they, but these are more unhappy than those. It's often the case. So the unhappiness is something that when it's recognized as unhappiness is accepted, something happens to it, it begins to dissolve. But the really unhappy people are so identified with the unhappiness, which is a combination of certain recurring thoughts in your head, a certain narrative that is not pleasant, whether it is about my life, dreadful thing, my life. Why did it all go so wrong, wrong? Or whether the narrative is about somebody else. You know what he did, what she said and did, and the narrative may be about something that hasn't happened yet, and it goes on and on. Or something that happened in the distant past, or not so distant past. So there's a narrative, and then there are emotions that are a reflection of the narrative. The narrative is thoughts. Certain thoughts that have a certain frequency, and then that awakens the emotional frequency, because the body thinks the narrative in your mind is reality, that is the reality that you're experiencing. So the body reacts with an emotion. Simple example, at night you can't sleep because you're extremely worried about what's going to happen to you, or somebody close to you, or even the world. And it all sounds very critical. There's a crisis in your head, not outside. Outside your head there's a pillow, and there's a blanket, and there's no unhappiness there. And if you look around the bedroom also, where's the unhappiness? And the body, since that is the critical reality that you inhabit, there is a crisis in your life. The body doesn't know the difference between what's actually happening and what's happening in your head. What's happening in your head is take it to be the absolute reality, but then you experience the emotion that goes with that kind of narrative, and so there's no awareness. And when you're trapped in that, you don't even really know that you're unhappy, because you are the unhappiness. The unhappiness has become your identity. So when you become the unhappiness, or let's use the Buddhist term suffering, when you are in this deep suffering, you don't even know you're suffering, because the suffering is a gigantic, huge chunk part of your sense of self. And as all therapists know, that once the patient or the client, or whatever they call the people that come to them according to their school, they reach a point where there's a possibility of going beyond the deep-seated patterns, unconscious patterns, and then there's a huge resistance very often, because the person is afraid of losing a very important piece of their identity, and they have lived with an unhappy sense of self for years and perhaps even decades. They don't want to let go, and again, they don't know that consciously. They never say, I do not want to let go. But if they could say that, then that means there's already some awareness. So, lack of awareness, lack of presence, that is the unawakened state that still, unfortunately, millions of humans are trapped in that. But the moment you know, you recognize your inner state, that means there is an awareness, there is another dimension of consciousness that has emerged in you, through you. A deeper dimension of consciousness that is not the conditioned thinking. And so we can call it awareness, we can call it presence, we can call it the unconditioned consciousness. And then the beginning of freedom, or the possibility of freedom arises. And it's from there that you recognize your inner states as they arise. From there that you recognize your unhappiness and say, oh, you can feel the unhappiness. But the moment you become aware of suffering or unhappiness in you, you're no longer feeding it with your thoughts. As long as you're not aware, you're feeding it as a vicious circle. You're feeding it with your thoughts, with your narrative. Your narrative creates more unhappiness. The unhappiness creates more thought. And you're trapped in that. So you make it your practice to be aware of your inner states, and meaning no matter what situation arises in your life, whether it's little things, big things, difficult situations, difficult people, so whatever it is, realize that the primary factor in any situation is your inner state, because that determines how you respond. Whatever arises in your life is actually to be used in your practice, so that you do not become dependent on what's going on externally in your life. So your inner state gradually is no longer determined, perhaps still a little bit, yes, but not completely determined by outer events, people, situations, and so on. Inner freedom arises. That's awakening. So there's a disidentification from the movement of thought and the fluctuating emotions. You're not repressing anything, you're allowing it. But you can only allow it because there's an awareness. And that awareness is you, ultimately. That is what I sometimes call the deep I, as opposed to the surface I. There's the surface I, which is the conditioned person, the entity that you are for a while, and there is the deep I, which is the consciousness. My usual analogy, which probably you've heard me say, the ocean. The surface of the ocean, the wave or the ripple, is the surface I, and the depth of the ocean is the deep I. And an awakening human is a ripple on the surface of the ocean that, until recently, had been completely identified with its ripple existence on the horizontal dimension of the surface of the ocean, looking at every other ripple as another ripple, not me. And always you have to be very careful with the others. And the ego actually likes the others to be as other as possible. And then the little ripple begins to realize that there's a depth the moment it stops thinking about its ripple existence, and that there's a thinking subsides and something else remains, something else that is very deep, has no form, is just a presence. Be grateful for whatever your experience of this moment is, and if you cannot be grateful, at least allow it to be, because it already is. You did this little thing, allowing your experience as always to be, at least allow it to be, because it already is. In this little thing, allowing your experience already to be. Be grateful for whatever your experience of this moment is, and if you cannot be grateful, at least allow it to be, because it already is.